Family Resource Center on Disabilities is the Region 1 Parent Training and Information Center of Illinois. You can call us at 312-939-3513 or email us at frcd.org. We also encourage you to visit our website at www.frcd.org and follow us on Twitter at FRCDPTI. You can subscribe to our YouTube page at FRCD1231 and like us on Facebook. Family Resource Center on Disabilities is not a law firm or a legal service agency. Thank you for joining Family Resource Center on Disabilities Lunch and Learn webinar, Dissecting the IEP Part 4, Accommodation and Modifications. This presentation will be presented by FRCD Bilingual Parent Trainer, Zabita Pasha. This webinar is being recorded. If you have questions, you can either raise your hand in the attendees box or you can type your question in the question box of your control panel. Copies of this webinar presentation will be sent to you following the webinar. Okay, Zabita, you may begin.
Thank you so much, Paula. Welcome everybody to our webinar today. As Paula stated, it is the Part 4, and it is about accommodation and modification, which is a big piece of our conversations most of the time about the IEP. And it is also a big piece of conversation when it comes to students who may have also 504. Before I go ahead and talk about the topic and the outcome and the learning objectives, I would like to say that Family Resource Center on Disabilities is a parent training information center. What we do is support, empower, educate, inform the parent to be the best advocate for their children. And also, as the slide is showing, making an informed decision about your child's IEP. There is also a piece of information and refer that we practice every day in our line of work. Every state should have a parent training information center. There is more than 105 centers in the United States. Family Resource Center is the Region 1. There is another center down south in Effingham that cater to other counties. We cater to 8 counties, that is equal to 2/3 of Illinois children who have special education services or 504. So we will go ahead and dive into the presentation. I hope my slides are working. Okay. I truly apologize. I may have to get Paula to help. Paula, I don't see the screen. It's, again.
Okay, one moment, Ms. Zabita.
Okay, I think technology today is not very helpful.
Okay, Zabita, we'll use my screen.
I would say yes, because I think my screen is not acting right.
Okay, one moment. Okay, Zabita, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay.
You may have to make it a little.
Yes, one moment. Okay.
All right, so we passed that. We go to the next slide, and please and thank you. Okay, so the accommodation and modification, it is part of the IEP. And when we talk about the IEP, of course, we are talking about IDEA, which is the Individual Disability Education Act, which is the special education law. So all students supposed to make the expected progress by using supports and services, including the accommodations and modification. So the IEP team is required to identify what are the accommodation modifications that will be applied when we are talking about the student's IEP. What are the specific and detailed time and environment? When we talk about accommodation and modification, we include and involve the environment. So when are they necessary for the student? It is based on the IEP team discretion. We have to use a very detailed information when we talk about the accommodation and modification. We have to consider the student present level, and also what are the environment and timing. So it is linked to the time and to the place that these accommodations and modification will be applied. Sometimes we throw some language when we are advocating for our children. All of this is because we have high expectations. High expectations are good. There is nothing wrong with it. There is no doubt that high expectation will make a difference for our kids and any student. But we must know that the high expectation of a student who is performing poorly in the past does not need, indeed, help to improve their performance. But high expectation is truly to make a difference can be sustained. So what does that mean? It needs to have certain conditions in place, and there are all conditions that can be developed and nurtured. First, we need that the teachers have to have the ability to gather data, and also, of course, we're talking about qualified personnel based on IDEA regulations. So when we say that, those teachers need to know how to differentiate the instruction based on the unique need of the child. For example, a child with ADHD who have executive functioning and functional skill deficits, it's different to teach this child with ADHD than a child with autism who have serious social emotional, have also sensory, and also have academic skill deficits. For example, my daughter who is in high school, she reads at 9th, 10th grade level, but she comprehends at 5th grade level. So her accommodation is supposed to be based on her level of comprehension when we talk about comprehension. Sometimes we kind of get tangled in a lot of conversation about the accommodation and modification in the IEP, but we have to consider key components, and data collection is so important to give us information and how to craft the IEP with the right accommodation and modification. Next slide, Paula. So what are the learning strengths and the needs of the students? That's one of the things that we have to consider when we talk about accommodation, how the students learn, what are his strengths, are the strengths something that is pertaining to the academic functioning and performance? Is it functionally higher than his academic? It depends on how the disability is adversely affecting the learning. How the learning needs affect the student. What does it mean how the disability is affecting, in other words, adversely their learning? What specialized instruction is needed to achieve the grade level standard? What does that mean? The differentiation of instruction to bridge the gap. Example again of my daughter who comprehends at the 5th grade level and she's in 10th grade. How are we going to bridge that gap with the provision of accommodations and modification? What accommodation will increase the student's access to instruction and reduce the effect of their disability. And that is so important to retain when we are advocating and requesting accommodation. When we negotiate What is that specific thing that will enhance my child's performance and bridge the achievement, the academic achievement gap? There are many tools that we will talk about later in this PowerPoint, and we have to also be mindful of the not only the strengths, not only the needs, but also the environment where the child is learning, and that is so important. In the previous slide, it was specifically saying the environment, and we have to take that in consideration. The accommodation, it helps and enhances the participation of the student with the disability to access the general education curriculum and to make gains, meaningful gains. I want to highlight this, meaningful gains, just like any other student without disabilities. Now, we have to be also reminded that the disability is there and it is hindering them. Again, like the 5 years gap for my child in terms of comprehension, it will not bridge within 1 year. It is a work in process. We also have to be reminded that the IEP, in most of the circumstances, the progress is incremental. What does that mean? We talk about the accommodation and modification from previous year. Did they work? Yes or no? If they did not work, we will talk about other modification and accommodation. If they did work, then we have to go to the next step and to the next set of accommodation and modification as we challenge the child in their curriculum. We have to be mindful also of rigor as we talk about our children's curriculum. There is one curriculum, which is the general education curriculum, that needs sometimes modifications, sometimes accommodation for the child. My definition of accommodation and modification is to access for success. And both of them, they work for the same reason, but they have different dynamics and different strategies and interventions. Next slide, Paula, please. When we talk about the accommodation, like I said earlier, we need data collection. The data collection for this specific topic is the present level on both academically and functionally. And why is that? It's to determine the needs. We have to also look at the goals. What do we want to accomplish from now to next year for this particular student based on their needs? Like I said earlier, there are students who have functional needs deficits. There are students who have academic needs deficits, and there are students they have on both, and on top of that, social emotional. We have to also determine what is needed in order to meet those goals. So that is exactly what accommodation and modification does, is to meet and make sure that that goal will be met. In other words, the accommodation is to assure the provision, is to assure the access to grade level instruction and also state assessment, statewide assessment. Why is that? Because it's going to give us information about the present level. In other words, all of this information, it is linked to each other. It's so important to have the present level, determine where my child is at this year, functionally and academically. And then from there, we go to the goals and to bridge the gap. And with the goals, we use strategies. And to complement those strategies and intervention, we add the accommodations and modifications. And all of this is to ensure that the students are adequately included in accessing general education curriculum. And rigor. We have to make sure that rigor is in the conversation. Because when we say modify, sometimes we underline modifying down. And sometimes it works for certain students. Sometimes it does not work for everybody. We have to understand that special education is not a cookie cutter. It's not one size fits all. Next slide. So the accommodation is the provision on how the student will access and demonstrate learning. There are supports and services that provide the student to access general education curriculum and demonstrate their learning. How am I learning this? How am I reading this? Am I reading it by practicing the reading? Am I listening to it and then am I able to read it? Am I looking at it before I read it? These are type of questions that we talk about when we say accommodations and modifications. They do not mean big changes in instruction levels. So the accommodation, they don't change the instruction level. Or nor the content. The content, it is intact when it comes to accommodation. Rather, it supports the student to be provided with the equal opportunity to learn and demonstrate the ability that he or she is able to do math, reading, write, science, and so forth and so forth. So the accommodation is access to demonstrate learning. It is very important for us to remember this, because when we kind of brainstorm with the team during the IEP, and I'm asking, what accommodation are you going to provide? Some of them, they just say, oh, we will give fewer questions. No, that is not accommodation. Accommodation is when, for example, my daughter, she has serious and severe sensory issues, especially when it comes to the light, the noise. She's easily distracted. Her accommodation should look like away from distraction, away from windows and doors and hallways, away from lights because of that sensory, and also neurologically she cannot look at the lights a lot because she has migraines. And her accommodation also can look like preferential seating kind of close to the teacher so she can stay on pace and follow up with the teaching at the moment. If she's far from the teacher, then we talk about somebody prompting her and making sure that she's engaged in learning. So this is the job of the accommodation, is to help the student access and help the student to show their learning. If I am given for students who have very, very hard time to write because of fine motor skills, and I give this student modified pencil, for example, and weighted pencil or weighted pen, the student should show me with this accommodation that he or she is able to have a good grip and start writing. That's exactly, what accommodation does. It's the access and also the equal opportunity to be taught the same curriculum and be successful in getting the outcome of the outcome of accessing the curriculum. So the accommodation can be applied for all the areas where the child had deficits or has needs, and the accommodation can be also provided on a social, emotional, and also for people who have English language proficiencies. It recognized the main team consideration for making decision on how to instruct or teach the student. That's what accommodation is. So they are also practices and procedures that provide inclusion in content. They do not reduce the learning expectations. If you remember when we talked, when I started the webinar, we talked about high expectations. So accommodation does not touch the content, does not touch my high expectation of my child reaching that goal by the end of the year where she will comprehend at the 5th grade and a half or 6th grade. It has to demonstrate a growth. It has to demonstrate that there is an ability to do and a skill that was learned during, the school year. So that's the accommodation. The definition of accommodation, it's not only for day-to-day, it's also for assessment. However, we will talk about that, in a few minutes. If you can move to the next slide, Paula. So accommodations are instructional or test adaptation, and we hear that a lot when it comes to the test adaptation. What does that mean? It's not reducing the content of the test, but it is giving the test at a smaller increment. Let's say you have my child with this attention deficit. We will give her, the 1-hour test in 10 minutes increments, and we have a watch as we give her the test. The accommodations are generally provided when the student is expected to reach the same level of proficiency as non-disabled students. And this is a very important information to retain. However, sometimes it confuses us. Again, like my child who comprehends at the 5th grade level, she cannot reach that level at the end of the school year because the gap is a little wider. In other words, the accommodation should generally provide the student the expectation to reach some level of growth and a success, specifically for those goals that they are lined up in comprehension. The accommodation should never reduce the learning or the performance expectation that we hold for the students. Again, it is only access. It's the support provided, so the accommodation are support provided so the student have the equal opportunity to learn and demonstrate what they have learned. Next slide, Paula, please. So it is a little redundant, but kind of a drill on they do not substantially change instructional level or content. They provide the equal access to the curriculum. Main thing to retain from the accommodation is the student or your child has to demonstrate what they have learned with the accommodation. In other words, you give them a little bit of support through the accommodation and see what they have learned on their own. And that in itself is independence. Remember that special education provision is to enhance the student's independence when they become an adult. So we have to talk about these things even at an early age. We have a great conversation yesterday when I was involved in a meeting, and one of the wonderful teachers, she was asking the parent, what do you want your child to do when they are 22 and out of the school? I found that very amazing how that teacher is putting out there this question where the parent is focusing on 3rd grade material. Can my child read? Can he identify, sight words? Can my child add? Can my child multiply? She was trying to connect the dots between, okay, we're doing this now, but what this child want to be later so we can provide that those services according that what the child want to be. Let's say you have children and they change their minds. You have children that want to be in sports and want to be in NBA, but you have children, these children may not be able physically or even intellectually to do those things. So, but it does not mean they cannot work in that field. They can. With the accommodation, let's say if he cannot dribble a ball or cannot be on the court, for basketball, they can be on the side doing something different or helping them, to be in the health aspect of that NBA business. Okay, we have to learn how to give, the players, the ice when they get hurt. We have to time them when they practice. We have to provide all of those refreshments, and everything has to be provided. So how I'm going to accommodate this is, for example, by a timer app, and I love certain apps that we use on a daily basis is a timer. Okay, once they practice for 15 minutes, I will accommodate this student to be reminded to give the refreshment and the towel to the player. So he's still involved in the NBA business, but on a different level. And I'm giving him an accommodation to remember. And as he get drilled and remember to give the towel and the drink or refreshment, I should say, to the player in practice or during the play, then I will withdraw that accommodation and see if he remember to do that on his own. and that is the job of accommodation. At a certain point, we have to withdraw that support to see if the student have learned the skill on their own. The accommodation, it is also based on individual strengths and needs. You have children who learn visually through their eyes. We need to provide visual supports as accommodation. We have those who are auditorial. We have to give, speech to text or something like that to help them, kind of hear it and also see it if it is necessary. It is, it may change in intensity and degree. There are students who have significant needs. They will need a lot of support. Those who have kind of not significant need, they will, in other words, supposed to have the adequate support. Instead of adequate, I will change it to appropriate support for them to be successful. Again, the accommodation does not touch the instruction or the material or the content of the curriculum. Rather, it changes a little bit the environment. It changes the timing. Many accommodation also changes not the space where I am. There are kids who have sensory that I'm known through my daughter's schooling. They have that significant sensory issue where they don't want to sit at a desk and a hard chair. They need, those cushions. They need those the bin bags. And some of the students, I have known students with medical needs. They are laying down and they are reading and doing math. The accommodation is to help them access that curriculum no matter how it's going to look like, and it's going to involve a lot of things. Next slide, Paula, and thank you. So again, it does not change the curriculum. It does not change the amount of the information to be learned, such as change, fall, and the modification. So now, when we talk about accommodation categories, it's the presentation. So students may access to information in alternate mode, like I said, speech to text or text to speech, for example. Response, student might complete work in a different way, giving them, a break, type in their assignment instead of writing it. Making sure that they have all the tools, like the kid, the student, or the example of the student who have fine motor issues, and we're giving them, that weighted pen or pencil. Timing and scheduling is one of the categories, so students have flexibility in how time is organized to complete work, specifically the homework and the classroom work. Sometimes we talk and we are not specific. We have to be specific on timing and scheduling. If the child has difficulties in completing the work in the classroom, for sure they will have difficulties completing the homework. So if we're talking about extended time for classroom assignments, we have to pair that with extended time for homework. Now, I have seen a little abuse, and I'm allowing myself to say this. I have seen a little abuse in timing, to where the child and all of us understand the children can be manipulative. They know they have a day or two to turn in their homework, and they wait the last minute. I highly recommend, if you are a parent and you have children who really process and understand a lot, that they don't need to know they have 2 days to turn in the homework. Once the homework lands at home, do it. If you don't finish it because you can't or you are not feeling well, then you have a little bit of time. But just don't say, oh, you have time. You can do it whenever you want to, because they will get in that mode, and it is not really healthy. The setting is one of the accommodation category. The student may have to change the setting. I've seen kids who, including mine, she cannot focus if there is a lot of noise. So they pull her out sometimes to a quieter area where she can read, especially if they are doing independent reading, so she can sit and read without any distractions. We have a lot of examples. I believe Paula will send you listings of accommodations that you can see. So mainly the categories is the presentation, which is how we present that paper or that assignment or that lesson to the student, the response, how they will do it, and how they will access it, the timing and the scheduling, and then the setting. These are the categories. Next. So some of the example of accommodation. A student who have learning disability in reading may have difficulty reading the content or the question on a history test. So we will give this, we will provide this student um, the test to be read aloud to him, so they can access again the material and make sure that they are in tune, to that text during, the testing. There are many accommodations. Again, if we take it from this perspective of the curriculum, which is no modification. You see here, we are reading to the student for them to hear the story so they can, answer the question and what have you. We can also change the setting. If he or she get distracted easily, we can take the student out of, the noisy area and put them in a quieter area. If the student gets tired, and I have seen a whole lot of, an array of difficulties, especially when the students have medical illnesses, they need that break. They need a sip of water. Sometimes they need to stretch and get up and walk around. These are accommodations. Sometimes teachers, they said, well, we don't do this because it is a standardized testing. No, IDEA is specific, and it says that the student should access the curriculum by providing accommodation and modification and individualizing their instruction. Next slide, Paula, and thank you. Thank you. So, modification. Modification is different from accommodation. Modification actually do change and target the skill or the constructive interest. They often reduce the learning expectation or affect the content. In other words, the modification affects the content of the curriculum in a way that can be taught and tested. So generally provided when the student is not expected to reach the same level as their peer. Example, my daughter's gap in comprehension prior year. So they have modification for comprehension. She cannot do the book report of the 10th grader. So what they are talking about is 2 paragraphs instead of book report. Book report at least is going to be 10 pages. She can't do that. So we shrunk her content to 2 paragraphs when she read a passage. Even the reading material or the curriculum and content is reduced from a whole book or novel to 1 chapter and do 1 or 2 paragraphs on it. You see how it is reduced, but it holds the same standards of work and her comprehension as non-disabled peers. So we are working slowly, steadily to bring her comprehension every year up. We need to see that growth. What does that mean? If she got last year the graphic organizer, this year we want her to look up the graphic organizer on her own, and that's an accommodation. If she got a chapter for this year for reading, next year we will expect for her to do at least a chapter and a half or 2. And that is the job of accommodation and modification, is to assure growth and learning skills for independence. The accommodation provides access without reducing learning expectation, but the modification can increase the achievement gap by lowering the expectation for what the student are expected to know or to do. You see, it is a little bit complex, but it is easy when we say access for accommodation modification is increased and access for success. by reducing and lowering the expectation. It does not mean we don't have high expectation in our children. We must have those high expectations, but we're talking about the expectation in accessing the curriculum in this instance. Next slide, Paula. So modification changed the content and the performance expectation for what the student should learn. For example, a student may work at a different level, for example, at a 4th grade level instead of 6th grade level in reading. We're presenting 6th grade level material, but we're reducing it. We're shrinking it to the 4th grade level. Or fewer concepts or skills. For example, you talking about division. Division requires multiple steps, especially if it requires regrouping. So it requires sometimes addition, most of the time multiplication and subtraction when we are regrouping. So at the grade level, we're talking about a 3rd grader who need to do division, and the curriculum is so cumbersome on this kid. So we will choose fewer math problems, expose him to the main fundamental skills. We're talking about division, then we make sure that he or she learns multiplication and subtraction and addition. Then we give him few problems on a sheet and make sure that he understands. By accommodating him, of course, we're putting him in a quieter area. We're giving him, the weighted pencil and pen. We're giving him the modified paper if they are unable to write, kind of legible. We have to provide all of those things, but we also give him fewer problems to see if he or she is able to do it on their own. So that is modification. The team must consider the student characteristic and the instructional task that is expected to demonstrate grade level content, the consistency with the standard based on the IEP for the classroom assessment. This speaks volume when we talk about the accommodation. Again, we're not talking about shrinking the learning, but shrinking the content to increase the learning. It goes, the other way. So we have to consider a lot of things, as we mentioned early in the presentation, the present level, the characteristic of the student. We have to consider all of those things. The learning style is so important. We talk about accommodation and modification, but we are oblivious of how the child learns and processes the information. Next slide. Modification examples is outlining state of writing an essay. You have these high schoolers, they're doing PowerPoints right now and doing all of this research. Instead of having that PowerPoint 36 slide, they can do an outline. They can do a small essay. Main thing is to give me the main idea or the purpose or the learning objective of that PowerPoint. Alternate book on topic being studied. Like my daughter's books are alternated in certain instances. In English and language art, she's not doing those 500-600 pages books. They're giving her small novels. That's alternate book, but the topic may be the same. If they have this semester, the theme is sports. So they are talking about the March Madness. They just finished it. Now they're talking about the baseball. So they had given her smaller books. The content is a little bit different than the 500 pages. They're given her also providing her with a word bank. What does it mean? What the vocabulary? Let's build vocabulary before we go any further. And that's so important, especially in the areas of literacy. We have to have that solid foundation of vocabulary and word bank. Reword question in simpler language. Better yet, I have seen in many instances multiple choice questions. And that really is so helpful to some students, not everybody. Or if the student is able, to comprehend and process all of that, they can simplify the question. If the question has 3 components, we can do 1 component. But we are going to get the same thing from that 3 stages question. We will get the same thing from 1, but simplified. Modified word load or length of the assignment. Instead of, again, the 3rd grade example in math, instead of giving him or her 30 problems in a worksheet, we can give them, just few. The main thing is to expose them to the skill and give them the foundational concepts and facts in math specifically. For language arts, we can reduce and give them lesser workload by shrinking the questions from 25 questions to 10. From like the big novel reading to 2 chapters. These are things that we can, and again, we will send you a lot of resources on examples of modifications. But modification, main thing, it is attached to the content and to the curriculum. It lowers the expectation, but it gives you the same outcomes. It just, it works in a different way. Next slide. So when we talk about both of them, we need to know what is the difference between accommodation and modification. So accommodation focuses on removing barriers and provide access to the general education. So literally it is access. Accommodation are designed for students who have barriers that can be removed to help them demonstrate what they know. There are many kids who are brilliant, but they just need simply a cushion on a chair, simply away from the window because they get distracted, simply a weighted pen or pencil because their grip is not too good on that pen. It does not mean they cannot write. They can, but they just need that little weight on the pen or pencil. They need a modified paper. They need the question to be repeated 2 or 3 times for them to understand. And make sure when you talk about these things, I will put also repeat the question and ask the student to repeat it to ensure understanding. So you can also hold the student accountable when you give them those accommodations and help them to access. Modification focuses on ensuring meaningful participation in the general education curriculum, and they are designed for students who would benefit from participation even though it is above their ability. In other words, they are in the general education curriculum, accessing the general education curriculum, but on a smaller scale. It is smaller. It is shrunk. It's very concise and condensed. Next slide. This is so important to look at it, and I will explain it deeply. The accommodation does not fundamentally change the standard in terms of instructional level, content, or performance criteria. What does that mean? You have this child who is in 6th or 7th grade, and we are exposing him to that grade level. But we are giving him the tools to access that grade level without changing the expectation. We're holding that child to the same standard as non-disabled peer, but we're giving him tools to access that curriculum and to be successful. The changes are made in order to provide equal access. So accommodation provides equal access in learning and opportunities to demonstrate the knowledge or the skill. The grades should be the same. If we have this 6th or 7th grade student and we're giving him this accommodation, the grade should be the same thing as non-disabled peer who does not have an IEP. If anybody have a question about this, it's so important to understand this point, especially those who have children with IEPs and have accommodations. For modification, it applies to students with disabilities specifically. The accommodation apply to all students. There are students who does not have a disability. In other words, the disability must adversely impact their learning for them to receive services in the first place. There are students who does not have an IEP, does not have a 504, but they need tools to access the curriculum. I have seen children who does not have IEP, but they have a larger screen. They have a bigger keyboard because, you know, they have fine motor skills, but it is not impacting their understanding, comprehension, functioning on any level. So the accommodation, it applies to all students. Modification is specifically for those who have a disability that is adversely impacting their learning. It changes the standard in terms of instruction. What does that mean? It changes the content of the curriculum to a smaller and smaller chunks, smaller portions, smaller questions, smaller math problem on a sheet. These are modifications. The changes are made to provide students meaningful and productive learning experience based on individual needs and abilities. And again, I'll go back to my child who is in 10th grade, comprehend at the 5th grade level. So the modification provided for her, especially on a literacy level, is to read less material, do less questions, and do less book report. Providing her with the accommodation, which are, she will have to look and hunt for the graphic organizer that will help her to do the writing of those 2 paragraphs. She will also be seated away from distraction. She will have a device, especially a computer, where she can type instead of writing because she gets tired easy and frustrated easy. So they are saying, okay, we will substitute the handwriting by a technology device that will, you know, just cut that headache because the anxiety spikes up high when it is too much. I have to read, comprehend, answer the question, and write them too much. I can't do it. And she shut down. I said, you know what, we can find a way where you can demonstrate that ability. So assistive technology is one of the tools, and you can consider it as accommodation, and sometimes it is modification. And when I say assistive technology is modification in certain instances, when you have devices that are equipped with programs. One of the programs that we use for my child is the Kurzweil. The Kurzweil helps her to highlight the words as she's reading. So I don't understand this word, the program will highlight it for me. She will type the word and it will be highlighted and it will kind of give her like the word bank, and she will look up the definition. She will understand those definitions. Most of the time, if I am around, I make her write them because writing is reading twice. She get a little frustrated, but here is my modification for that here at home. Is I give her 5 words at a time and a break. You do 5 words, you take a break, drink water, walk, come back and do the other 5. So that's a modification. But she is showing me the ability that she's able to look up the definitions. She's using the program, the Kurzweil, for her to gather in the first place what are the difficult words that I don't understand. So I highlight this with the program. The modification gives you a different grade. Especially, it depends on the need. For mine, her grading scale is significantly modified. The A is the B minus in regular grade. So that modification will impact the grading scale or the grades. It is different from the student without disabilities. The accommodation, no, the grade should be the same because it is only access. Next slide. I think we are almost done, but I would like to stop. These are resources. I will stop a little bit at the don'ts, the do's and the don'ts for the accommodation. If we're talking about accommodation, we have to, first of all, identify the needs and the present level. We just cannot throw accommodation just in the air just because. No, it has to show, the student has to show that there are problems for him or her to read a passage, even though he is at grade level, functioning at a grade level, but I'm having difficulties to even read. That's access. We also cannot just give input based on what we see. We have to have assessments done and evaluation to show us what the child knows and what the child does not know. I will stop also at the accommodation for testing. And when we talk about testing, I will combine both the classroom assessment and the standardized testing. In other words, when you hear your kids saying, oh, I have a quiz, make sure that they understand they have accommodation if they have extended time. Make sure that they understand if they are distracted easily, make sure that you say, okay, if you have your quiz, ask your teacher to put you in a quieter area. In other words, make them aware of their accommodation. That's a self-awareness of also their disability. When we talk about our kids, whenever, at whatever stage and age, we have to keep also in mind when this kid will be an adult, how they will function. And we have to bridge those gaps as early as possible and assess as possible these accommodation and modification. But they have to be aware of them themselves. In standardized testing, there is no modification. Like the park, the map, or the NWEA, there is no modification. They will not shrink the content. They will not modify anything. However, they can read the test. They can give extended time. If, for example, the test is 2 hours, they can give 2 hours and a half. They can also give small chunks of the test to the kids if they get tired and frustrated easy. Also, they can give the test individually if there is, attention spam issues like mine. She gets distracted easily, so she is away from, from noise and what have you. Also, for the standardized testing, especially for those like myself in high school, they have to be very specific. When it comes to the ACT and the SAT, these are, the college access testing. The kid need to know what are my accommodations. I specifically work with certain parents to make sure that they have the accommodation in the kids' cell phone. Most of the kids have phones or devices. They have to have those bullet points. I need time. I'm starting at 11 and I have 50%, so I'm supposed to finish at 11:30. That's what that means. You explain and help your child to understand those numbers. A time and a half. Sometimes they put 75%, so that's 3/4 over the time. Make sure that they understand if they have modifications, how the material will look like for them. It depends, on how you work with your child and the team. You are part of the team. Make sure you understand it before, they implement the IEP. With that, I am open for questions.
Okay, I am not seeing any questions.
Okay.
So, if it is okay with you, Zabita, we can conclude today's webinar.
Okay.
Thank you everyone for joining us, and have a wonderful week.
Thank you.